after issuing that warning. So this noise immediately caught my attention, and it was a noise that I would describe as a very deep barrel chested man clearing his throat, kind of combined with the low, menacing growl. Thank you for having me on the show, Linda. I'm Robert Maxwell. I live in Northern Ontario, Canada, with my wife and daughter in a cabin in the woods that we built ourselves. And I'm more or less just a regular guy. I'm a videographer by trade and have always kind of mixed the backwoods rural lifestyle that we have here with high tech stuff and earning my living digitally. So um, as far as interest in Bigfoot, I've always been intrigued by mysterious topics that don't have a widely accepted explanation in mainstream understanding. I think I was probably 5 or 6 when my dad first told me about this creature that people call Sasquatch or Bigfoot, and I was intrigued from the get-go. And over the years, into adulthood, I sort of amused myself periodically by researching the topic and listening to other people's experiences, mostly just out of boredom, if I'm honest. But yeah, there was always kind of a genuine intrigue there. But it never really went beyond that for me until just a couple of months ago at the end of September, when my wife and daughter and I were vacationing on the other side of Canada from where we live, the West Coast, a place called Vancouver Island in British Columbia. And I had an experience, more than one experience, more accurately, that brought Bigfoot into the forefront of my mind in a way that my casual passing interest had never done. And since then, I've been determined to learn as much as I can about these creatures, these beings, and use the pretty good head that I've been blessed with on my shoulders to try to help other people make sense of their experiences as well. Just, try to find out the truth about these things and the experiences that people have with them.
Hi, I'm Linda Eastburn of Linda Eastburn YouTube channel, and I have a new book out called Threshold to Encounters. It's about 40 years of research and experience with all of these wild cryptids that many of you I know have encountered yourself. You can find it on Amazon.com. And how have you gone about doing that? How have you gotten the information out and talked with people regarding this?
Well, I've got a YouTube channel. It's called Cabin in the Woods, not the horror movie, but just Cabin in the Woods is the name of it. And it was never intended as a Bigfoot discussion platform, which is why I'm still kind of reeling with shock at how receptive people seem to be to this. But for the last 2 years, I've run this channel as a sort of casual, light-hearted vlog of our lifestyle here in the woods. My wife and daughter and myself, the building and DIY projects that I've taken on here, going ice fishing at our local lake, that sort of thing. How we heat our cabin with a coal burning stove. And doing videos about Bigfoot was never in the plan. It was never in the cards. It didn't even remotely enter my consciousness until I had this experience. And since then, as I said, I know you've talked with enough witnesses to know that experiences with these creatures fundamentally change a person. And I guess for me, that change came in the form of an unquenchable determination to continue learning about these things, not only to shed more light on my own experience for my peace of mind, but to do that for other people if I possibly can, through research, through clear, logical thought, and through boots on the ground investigation, which is something I've developed a keen interest in since my experience. So, I guess to summarize, my YouTube channel of 2 years, which was a DIY rural living sort of vlog for the bulk of that time, has now become the spot where I share my thoughts and research on Bigfoot.
Well, it sounds good. Now, tell me in detail what exactly those experiences were with Bigfoot that helped you make this kind of dramatic change in your thinking and even in the way that you approach the subject.
Sure, absolutely. So, as I said, this was a family trip we took to Vancouver Island, the three of us, my wife and daughter and myself, towards the second half of September of this year. And although I knew that the West Coast was well known for Bigfoot sightings, and Vancouver Island in particular has many reported sightings, I didn't think much about trying to seek out Bigfoot when we planned the trip. I did think casually once or twice, wouldn't it be cool if I saw something? Because a lot of people have reported sightings on this island, and we had always wanted to visit the West Coast to see the great big redwood trees and sequoias, and experience the Pacific Ocean, that particular characteristic of the coast that is in that area. And Bigfoot was several rungs down the ladder as far as my interest in going. It was mostly about having some relaxation with my girls after a very busy summer, and maybe possibly if I could talk to some locals, maybe I'd learn something interesting about this casual hobby of mine, which is all it was at that point. My pursuit of Bigfoot was just a passing interest. So we got to Vancouver Island, and my wife had arranged and rented an Airbnb cottage in a small town on the southern tip of the island, a place called Shirley. And it was a lovely spot with just one main road going through the area. Mostly it was forest, a small hamlet more than a town, about 10 or 15 minutes south of a larger center called Souk. And we picked this particular cottage, or rather, my wife did, because of the fact that there were at least half a dozen different beaches within a couple of miles of the area. So we wanted to be able to see a different beach every day. And this was pretty much the ideal spot to do that. So we did the tourist thing quite casually and happily for the bulk of the 12 days we were there, going to different beaches as we planned, eating at nice restaurants, having snuggled up movie nights on the couch in our rental cottage in the evenings, and occasionally driving into this larger town of Souk to get groceries and things like that. Very nice, restful sort of retreat. But towards the end of our time there, about 4 days before we were set to drive back to Victoria Airport and fly home back to Ontario, I had something happen that kind of set the avalanche of events in motion. First of all, to preface, I had had a conversation with our landlord, or the owner of our cottage, who lived on the same property as the cottage we were renting, kind of across the other side of the lot. He and his wife had their home there, and they had some miniature goats penned up between his home and our cottage, and also some laying chickens. So part of the deal with this particular cottage is that he graciously offered guests the chance to collect eggs from his chicken coop every morning for their breakfast, and no additional cost. So being a country boy and having grown up with chickens, that was a big plus for me. So my daughter and I made a daily routine of doing that. But one morning I ran into the gentleman. He happened to be out feeding the chickens in the early morning when I went out to collect eggs. And we got into a casual conversation. Nice guy. And I noticed right away he was wearing a Bigfoot t shirt. So I asked him about that. It kind of sparked my interest because I had that interest in Bigfoot, and I was on the West Coast. And he told me that he hadn't had an encounter himself, but he had heard of mysterious and bizarre things happening in the large patch of forest on the other side of the road opposite to our cottage. It was pretty much forest all around this cottage, a few little homes and cottages, but miles and miles of forest was the bulk of the surroundings. So he warned me. He said, if you take a walk in that forest across the road at night, keep your wits about you. Be careful, don't do anything dumb. Don't go too far in there without letting anyone know where you were. And obviously, I was intrigued by that. I kind of thought he was referring to the usual sort of forest dangers of the West Coast, black bears, mountain lions, that sort of thing. And he did tell some follow up stories after issuing that warning about losing some goats and chickens over the years. He said that one year he had had a black bear come out of that forest and push over the 5 foot wire and stake fence enclosing his miniature goats. And he caught the bear in the act of mauling one of the poor goats. And of course, by the time he got there and managed to scare the bear off by making some loud noises, this goat was already done for. He had to have it euthanized, unfortunately. The bear made a big mess. Like I said, it demolished the fence. There was goat blood and hair everywhere, just the way you'd imagine a bear would do such a thing, not much subtlety at all. Another time, he caught a mountain lion, which had leapt over the fence from the forest, right over the 5 foot fence and into the goat pen. And when he caught the mountain lion, it was in the act of trying to drag one of these miniature goats. I say miniature, they're still pretty hefty. It was trying to drag it back up over that 5 foot fence, but it wasn't able to do it, and the fence wasn't all that stable. So the mountain lion, also, like the bear, had pretty much demolished that section of fence in an attempt to drag its kill, one of his goats, back to its den or wherever it was going. So that goat, too, unfortunately, met a grisly end. Again, lots of blood and hair and disturbance. But there was a third loss that he mentioned, which I believe, if I recall correctly, was the most recent of his livestock losses, where he had gotten up one morning and went out to check the chickens and goats as usual, and there was simply one less goat than the day before. There wasn't any demolished fence, and there wasn't any blood or hair this time, like there had been for the bear and the mountain lion. There was just one less goat. One was missing. So he told that story, I think, to tie into his warning earlier about the mysterious nature of the forest surrounding this area. So that was the preface to my own bizarre experiences, and that got me thinking. And I asked him for more details, like, what do you mean by strange unexplained events in the forest? But he kind of got visibly uncomfortable, didn't seem to want to talk about it anymore. And I didn't want to be too pushy or overly inquisitive. I mean, the guy was renting a cottage to us and graciously giving us his eggs. I didn't want to be a jerk. So when he got uncomfortable, I kind of dropped it. But I was intrigued, to say the least. So fast forward, as I said, to 3 or 4 days before our return journey to fly home. And we were visiting a particular beach near our rental cottage, only about a minute or so drive up the one main road that goes through that hamlet. And this beach was called Muir Creek Beach, Muir, if anyone wants to look it up on the map. Muir Creek is the name of the beach. It was quite remote and not a tame, manicured sand beach by any means. It was fairly wild and rugged, lots of cobblestone, lots of bushes and brambles, and a whole lot of massive pieces of driftwood, entire driftwood trees in some cases, as many beaches on the West Coast have. We had been to this beach once before. Because it was so close to our cottage, it was actually the first beach we visited earlier in the trip. And we liked it so much that this time, towards the end of the trip, we decided to go again. So it was our second visit to Muir Creek Beach. And it was a favorite for my daughter because before you actually got to the water's edge, there was a run of at least a quarter mile where you had to park at the parking lot and weave your way through this narrow little footpath surrounded on all sides by many, many yards in every direction of thick, wild blackberry bushes. And we were there at just the right time of year that they were laden with delicious, ripe, wild blackberries, much better than the ones you get in the store, flavor wise. So we went there partially to see the beach, but partially to pick some berries and things too. Brought a bowl with us and had some berries for dessert that night. So we worked our way down to the beach. We picked some berries. And the first time we'd gone there, earlier in the trip, there were a few other families meandering around But this second time, we were the only people there. It was, as I said, quite remote, sort of a lonely kind of beach. And my daughter and I decided to climb up one particular bleach white driftwood tree, part of a tree anyway, a fairly large one that was lying on its side that had washed up obviously a long time ago. And the root structure of it was fully intact, kind of sticking out to the side. And just behind this tree we were climbing on was a soft sedimentary rock cliff of sorts, 30 to 40 feet high, topped with a sloping area of very thick, dense foliage and undergrowth. So we're climbing up this tree, pretending to, be monkeys or that we're making a fort or something like that. And my wife is walking near the water's edge about 40 feet away with her back to us. I think she was picking up small stones or fossils or something. And suddenly our play is interrupted by this resounding cracking noise, which I instantly recognize as a stone connecting with the log that we are on with incredible velocity. Like right away, I knew this stone didn't just roll down the sedimentary stone cliff behind us and bounce off the log. This was a resounding, echoing, cracking noise, like someone had whipped or used a slingshot even to fire a pebble at us really hard. That's what it sounded like. And so it immediately caught my attention for that reason, but even more so because although I didn't see the stone hit, it seemed to hit based on the sound on the opposite side of the log to where my daughter and I were climbing. But it did so in a spot directly opposite to my daughter's head. So, had she been a little higher on the log or on the other side of the log, it would have hit her and it would have hit her really hard. And because of the closeness to her, I assumed that someone was out of sight, whipping rocks, trying to hit her or us. So that immediately kind of triggered my protective father mode. And I start scanning the area. For just a second, I thought, maybe my wife whipped a stone, not knowing we were behind this log. It was quite a big piece of driftwood, and she could have conceivably not known we were there. Her sight line would have been blocked by the tree. So I popped my head over, but her back was to us. And I did call out to her. I asked, "You didn't throw a rock, did you?" And she didn't even hear me right away because of the surf. But when she found out what I was asking, it was clear. And I already knew. I was just asking because nothing else made sense. There were no other people in either direction. And I had a good view up the beach and down the beach. There was no one else there. And yet this pebble had been thrown at us. But I didn't have long to think about it because within a couple of seconds of hearing this echoing noise, the rock bounced off the log and ricocheted off a root or something, and it actually rolled down the face of the log on the side that we were on, so opposite to where it had hit. It rolled down, and I saw it rolling down, and I saw it hit the beach, and I picked it up. I actually brought it home. It's I'm not sure where it is right now, somewhere in my rock collection, but it was a white quartz pebble about an inch in diameter, fairly round, not perfectly spherical or anything, but fairly round and polished by erosion of the waves, I suppose. So, in realizing that my wife hadn't thrown this, uh, and knowing for sure that someone had thrown it, because as I said, gravity would not have produced that kind of velocity. I mean, it could have rolled down off that cliff, but it would have just, tapped on the log. The size it was, it didn't have the weight to make a noise like that unless it was whipped. Um, and it had made quite a noise. It was clear to me 100% that it had been whipped. And what's more, if it had rolled down off this cliff, it would have hit the top of the log. But based on where the sound was, I could tell clearly that it had hit the side of the log, a fairly direct shot. So impossible, again, for it to have hit there if it had just rolled off the top of this cliff that was behind and above us. But all the same, that's the only thing that made sense, that it had come from somewhere up there. And so I assumed that there were some teenagers or some, hooligan of some sort hiding up in this thick undergrowth at the top of this 30-foot cliff, and they were the ones who had thrown this at us. And I was quite mad because, again, I felt my daughter's safety was being threatened. So, just out of pure instinct more than anything else, I grabbed some fist sized stones myself from this cobblestone beach and I started whipping them up into the foliage at the top of this cliff, thinking that that's where this person was hiding, that it obviously zinged this pebble at us. And I thought, well, maybe I'll scare them, I'll flush them out, and then I'll give them a good telling off, whoever they are. But, 5 or 6 stones whipped in kind of a shotgun pattern from where I thought the pebble had been thrown from, and no response, no noise, no crying out or moving of foliage as someone ran away, nothing like that. So I was obviously puzzled, and I was examining the area thinking, how could a human have even thrown that? Because, for one thing, as I said, this was a 30-foot cliff topped with incredibly thick foliage, thick enough that it was basically like a wall of tangled briars and greenery. I couldn't even see 3 or 4 feet into it. So whoever was up there would have had to, have just the perfect line of sight to throw this rock without it hitting foliage to hit the log down where we were. But that seemed impossible because of the thickness of the foliage. That was one thing. But another thing was the top of this cliff didn't just level off into a flat area with tangled foliage. It kind of gradually went from vertical to a little bit more horizontal, but still quite steeply sloped, even where the foliage was growing. So you wouldn't be able to comfortably sit up there. It was steep enough that, if not for all the bushes and trees, I think if you were just sitting on a slope like that, you would slide right off because it was like a barn roof. And the third thing was I couldn't see a way, shy of being a professional mountain climber with all your gear in tow, that a person could even get up there. I mean, we're talking about a sheer, rather damp, slick surfaced sedimentary rock cliff topped with this steep, tangled, bunch of briars and bushes. I couldn't see a spot where, someone could have climbed up there from the beach to throw this rock. And yet the rock had definitely been thrown. And I was pretty sure it had been thrown from up there somehow, with a whole lot of strength, a whole lot of force behind it. So that kind of put me off staying at the beach for too much longer. It gave me an uncomfortable feeling, mostly because of my daughter's safety. I mean, I was intrigued, but also perturbed. So shortly after that, we packed up our, snack bags and things, and we left Muir Creek Beach, went back to our cottage. And, I told my wife about it. She didn't really know what to think. She just commented that it was weird, which it was. And I didn't think too much more about it for the rest of the day. But as the day turned into evening, I started to think back to the story from our cottage owner that he had told me earlier in the visit about the mysterious happenings in and around the forest in that area. And again, this beach where the rock was thrown was less than a mile, and probably even less than half a mile from our cottage. So the more I thought about the rock and the gentleman's story and the cryptic warning about these mysterious woods, the more my curiosity welled up. And I thought, I've got to take a walk in those woods because, what if it was Bigfoot? I've heard enough firsthand encounters through interviews and things in, pursuing this hobby to know that rock throwing is a thing. It's one of the classics, with a Bigfoot encounter. Could it have been that? I mean, I wasn't sure, but I was curious. And, his story about the goat disappearing and stay out of the woods unless you're being really careful. I had to know more. I'm a naturally curious person. So, against my better judgment and against the wishes of my wife, I decided to take a walk that evening in these woods across the road. And by the time I made that decision, it was already well after dark. I thought I'd have a great big flashlight available because our host had left one in the cottage, but turns out the batteries were dead and there weren't any replacement batteries in there. So, foolishly enough, I went across the road towards this patch of woods with just my phone and the phone flashlight. I just really wanted to see if anything else happened. I didn't really think it would, but I also felt that I would regret it if I didn't check things out. Putting the weirdness of the stone throwing and the weirdness of the gentleman's story together, along with the fact that Vancouver Island, as I said, is well known for Sasquatch encounters. So I cross this road and I walk into the tree line, and it's very thick, old growth forest. Not as big trees as in some areas of Vancouver Island, but still bigger and taller than what I'm used to here in Ontario. And it was very slow going because there was a lot of undergrowth and it was very tangly, and there were fallen old rotting logs on the ground and bushes and things. So I couldn't really go in a straight line. Just had to kind of carefully weave my way along, holding my phone flashlight up. And I had made it about 100 yards into the tree line. And I was looking back and I could just barely see some twinkling lights from maybe our cottage or the cottage next door to it through the trees. I wanted to kind of keep those in view so I wouldn't lose my sense of direction. And I had paused at about, like I said, 100 yards or so in. And I was just kind of making up my mind, should I go a little further or should I turn back? I knew I wouldn't be able to see those twinkling lights from the cottage for very much longer if I continued. So I had just made up my mind to go a little bit further, and if nothing odd happened, to just head back and call it a day, when I suddenly heard a noise coming from further into the forest ahead of me. And it wasn't very loud, but it was quite noticeable because the forest was surprisingly quiet. No night birds or insects or anything. So this noise immediately caught my attention, and it was a noise that I would describe as a very deep barrel chested man clearing his throat, kind of combined with the low menacing growl that dogs will do to warn you to stay away. Kind of like and I'm not it's not going to be an accurate imitation, but I'll do my best. It was kind of like kind of like that. And as I said, it was coming from deeper into the forest in the direction I was going. As a rough guess, maybe 50 to 60 yards further into the trees than where I was standing at that moment. As I mentioned, I think I was about 100 yards into the forest, and maybe 60, 70 yards further at the most was this sound. So immediately I freeze and I'm thinking bear. That's my first thought. I know that there's no grizzlies on that part of Vancouver Island, but there are black bears. So I'm understandably nervous and thinking I'd probably better get out of here because I don't want to run into a black bear. And maybe that's what the guy was. Maybe we're just dealing with a bear infested forest here. But before I had really even had a chance to fully process the noise and turn around and start making my way back towards the road and our cottage, I heard a second noise coming from roughly the same spot. And it was a very different noise than the first one. Happened, I'd say, about 30 to 40 seconds after that throat clearing, growling, grunting sound. And it was the sound of like a large tree being twisted. That's what it sounded like. Kind of like when you're walking through a forest and there's a strong wind and you hear a lot of trees around you creaking, like the sound of the wood fibers moving as the wind pushes those trees around. It was like that, but it was only one tree making the sound. That's how it seemed to me. And what's more, there wasn't any wind that night, not even a breeze. It was completely calm. So I hear this growl, and then from the same spot, roughly 60, 70 yards into the bush, deeper in ahead of me, I hear this tree twisting sound. Sounded like a fairly big tree being twisted or bent or something. So at that point, the two noises together got me freaked out enough that I quickly turned around, and as quickly as I could, which wasn't all that quick because of the terrain, I made my way out of there and back to the road, out of the tree line, and crossed the road and ran back into our cottage and waited for my adrenaline to calm down a little bit. And I told my wife what happened, and she was surprised because I was only out there for like 10 minutes, maybe. The whole thing happened within 10 minutes of leaving on my little expedition. And she didn't know what to think. And we both were kind of thinking bear, but I'd be lying if I said in the back of my mind, I also wasn't considering the possibility that it was something more mysterious than a bear, possibly a Sasquatch, because again, I had heard enough eyewitness encounters to know that sometimes pushing on trees or doing things with trees, banging on trees, whatever, is another one of their MOs. So I was spooked and curious, and I went to sleep that night, kind of not sure what to make of it. I got up the next morning, and in the light of day, my curiosity kind of rekindled. It seemed a whole lot less scary, as it often does when there was sunlight. So I decided about midday, after we'd done a few tourist things, to take another walk in the forest, probably about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. This time in the light of day, so I figured whatever's out there, I should be able to see it this time. I should mention that I shone my phone flashlight in the area where I thought these noises were coming from. And I didn't see a thing, but the phone flashlight was so weak, I'm sure the light wasn't able to penetrate near far enough through this thick forest to have shown me anything anyway. But I thought maybe I'd have a chance if whatever made those noises was still there. And I knew how to behave around black bears and things growing up in the country here in Ontario, and I've encountered black bears before, so I wasn't that scared of the bear possibility. So I take another walk across the road, try to retrace my steps as best I can recall, and I make it to the spot where I figured I'd been the night before, about 100 yards into the tree line. And then I slowly start walking further towards where I thought the two noises had come from, based on, again, my recollection, because there was no visual cues at all the night before. And I only made it about maybe 20 to 30 yards further than my stopping point the night before when something caught my attention. It was a fallen tree, a fairly large and tall one, kind of adjacent to where I was looking. And it was an evergreen tree of some sort, I think a balsam by the look of the needles. And what caught my attention about it was that, number one, it still had fresh green needles on it. It looked like a perfectly healthy tree. No decay that I could see. I was probably 30 yards away from it when I first noticed it. And all the foliage on it was fresh and perfectly green. So it looked like, for whatever reason, it had fallen down, but it had done so very, very recently. And as a guess, I'd say the height of it would have been about 40 feet if it had been standing up. The diameter of the trunk looked to be around about a foot or so. But the other thing that was odd about it was that, based on my recollection of those two noises the night before, this fallen tree with completely fresh green foliage seemed to be exactly where the two noises had come from. Both the throat clearing and the tree twisting wood fiber creaking noise. This fallen tree was right there, like where they had come from. So immediately, of course, I think, what was that wood fiber creaking noise, the sound of like the beginning of this tree falling down for some reason? And why would a seemingly perfectly healthy tree fall down? No, I could think of a few reasons, of course. I've grown up in the forest, and sometimes trees that look good and healthy and have green foliage on the outside can have root rot, or the trunks can be rotten on the inside, or they can have bug damage from carpenter ants moving in or something. So I thought most likely it was something like that. And maybe I had just heard the beginning of it starting to tip over. I knew that what I'd heard the night before wasn't the sound of it actually falling, because that would have made much more of a crash, but it sounded like it could have been the beginning of it coming down. But that didn't explain the weird grunt or growl. And of course, I did think of the possibility in the back of my mind. I was trying to stay logical and impartial, but I thought, sometimes you do hear about Bigfoot creatures pushing over trees. Like that's a thing too. So I thought I'd better go get a closer look at this tree. And it was still, 20, 30 yards away. I can easily tell as long as some part of the roots, were visible. Yeah, I can tell if it's root rot or if there's bug damage or anything. And most likely it was one of those, I figured. I couldn't see the bottom of this fallen tree from where I was because some bushes were blocking it. So I had just made up my mind to go up and take a closer look, take some pictures of it, rule out the possibility that it was Bigfoot in all likelihood. That's what I expected I would find. But before I had gone more than another yard or two, actually, I should back up. Before I saw the tree, I forgot one thing. There was kind of a natural opening in the forest. In hindsight, probably a game trail of some sort, because there were no signs of cutting or chainsaw work. And just before I kind of caught sight of this fallen tree, as I'm walking further into the bush from where I had been the night before, prior to seeing the tree, I noticed a deep impression, a single deep, roughly rectangular print, if you will, in the middle of this natural opening, this game trail of sorts. And I kind of got excited because I thought, could that be a footprint? But upon closer examination, it didn't really look like a footprint. It didn't have distinct toe marks or anything, but it was roughly foot shaped. It was about 50% longer than my shoe clad foot. I'm a size men's 11. And it was about 50% wider than my foot too. So whatever it was a big thing. But again, I couldn't swear it was a footprint because it was indistinct. The forest floor had a lot of, needles and foliage and things. So it wasn't like a clean print like you see, in mud or something. But it was very deep. It was at least 3 inches deep. And it didn't look like a hole that some animal had dug because there was the same needles and foliage that were on the forest floor were pressed down into the bottom of this impression too. So I'm thinking if it was something digging a hole, a raccoon or a porcupine or something, looking for grubs or whatever, it would have been fresh, clean soil. And there was a little bit of freshish looking dirt kind of around the outsides of it, but it was like needles and foliage pressed down into the bottom for the most part. 2 or 3 inches deep, deeply impressed into the forest floor. I actually tried jumping up and down in that spot to see if I could make a print similarly deep with my full body weight. And I'm a pretty big guy, about 250, but not even close. Like half an inch was about as deep as I could make an impression. So if it was a print, it was something very heavy, that's for sure. But again, I wasn't sure at the time, and I'm still not 100% sure that it was indeed a footprint. And the odd thing was there was only one of them. So, that didn't seem to align with the footprint hypothesis either. So going back to where I left off, I see this impression. I examine it. I got a little bit of footage of it. And then I continued on a little further. And that's when I saw this fallen tree, again, about 20 or 30 yards ahead of me. And I decided to go take a closer look at this tree to try to determine how it had fallen because it looked perfectly healthy, as I said. But before I had a chance to move much closer to it, I caught a flash of movement out of the corner of my eye, further into the forest than I was, and a little bit to my right, almost straight ahead of my eye line, but a little bit over to the right. So I glance up immediately to see what had made this movement. I had only seen it out of my peripheral. And it was a hulking black shape, roughly twice as tall as it was wide. And as a guess, I'd say 8 to 9 feet tall, although it was hard to tell. It was probably 60 yards further into the bush than I was. So about maybe 30 yards beyond the fallen tree at that point. And my impression was, based on the movement I had caught out of my peripheral vision, that this thing, whatever it was, had moved about a foot over to the right from an area where it would have been more visible if I had been looking directly at it, to an area where it was more obscured by branches and foliage. So when I looked up at it and trained my eyes on it after registering the movement out of my peripheral vision, it was staying stock still. I whipped out my phone and I got a few seconds of footage of it because I had seen it move, and movement to me implied that it was a living creature, obviously. The weird thing was, though, it didn't look like any living creature that I knew about, including all the descriptions I've heard about Bigfoot. It didn't have, at least as far as I could tell at that moment, it didn't seem to have a distinguished head or arms or legs or anything. It was more or less just a black mass, as a guess, again, about 9 feet tall and at least 4 feet wide. But more than anything else, it kind of looked like a root ball, like those masses of soil and debris that the roots of a tree will pull up with them when a tree falls over in the woods. And it kind of looks like a big black, messy looking shape. That's kind of how it looked. I thought that looks like a root ball. It doesn't look like a bear. It doesn't look like how I imagined Bigfoot to look. But there was the troubling fact that I had seen it move. And I was like 99% sure I had registered movement. That's what made me look up and look at this thing. And there it was, staying stock still, this big black thing. And because I had seen it move, even though it didn't look like a living creature, now that I was training my eyes on it, and it appeared to be staying stock still, I I wasn't sure what to make of it, but it got me nervous for some reason. I had this odd, strong fear kick in, which isn't typical for me at all. I mean, as I said, I live in the woods, grown up going in the woods and hunting and fishing and seen some strange things in the woods before, but nothing that had given me this palpable fear. The thought did cross my mind that perhaps it was a bear, and bears can kind of be lumpy and indistinct sometimes in their shape, especially from a distance and partially obscured by foliage. But that didn't really hold water because, as I said, I've seen black bears. Black bears are the only kind of bears on most of Vancouver Island, including that part. And when black bears stand on their hind legs, which they do sometimes do, they're rather lanky. I mean, they look pretty thick and heavy set when they're going on all fours, but unlike grizzlies, when a black bear stands up, it kind of looks skinny for the most part. And they're also not all that tall. I mean, a big one might be 6, maybe at the very most 7 feet tall when standing on its hind legs. A grizzly obviously can be much taller and broader than that, but black bears, not so much. But this thing, whatever it was, root ball or living creature, and I was thinking living creature at this point because of the movement I had seen, it was massive. As I said, at least an easy 4 feet wide, 8 to 9 feet tall, far bigger than any black bear has a right to be, and probably even bigger than most grizzlies standing on their hind legs. So combining that with the weirdness of this tree being pushed over, which I still hadn't had a chance to examine closely, by the way, but this shape and this movement and this tree and the weird noises from the night before and our cottage owner's strange and cryptic story, I decided it was time to leave. Realistically, logically, I thought, despite the size, it's got to be a bear somehow, just a bigger than average one, I suppose. So I turned around and I got out of there. Again, struggled my way through the thick foliage, crossed the road, ran back into our cabin, told my wife the whole story. And once again, she didn't really know what to make of it. She suggested I call my dad and see what he thought. It's a weird story, and she didn't doubt me, but she just had no conclusion. So I did. I phoned my dad back in Ontario and told him the whole thing too. The stone throwing incident, the gentleman's weird story, our cottage owner, and now this latest incident that had just happened with this strange black shape. And my dad kind of surprised me because he said, "Well, are you going to go back?" That's the first thing he said. And then he followed up with, "I think you should go back, see if you can get some close up views of that tree, it probably was root rot like you thought, but maybe it wasn't. And maybe you'll be able to get a closer look at this thing, whatever it is, and see if it left any traces, footprints or hair or something. I thought he was going to, kick into fatherly protective mode, which no matter how old you get, I think your parents always have that instinct. But no, he surprised me. He said, you should, go there and try to gather some more evidence, basically. So his curiosity and suggestion, and it got me thinking. And I thought most of that afternoon and evening. And by the next morning, I decided, yeah, that is something I think I should do. Because the next day we were set to drive back an hour to the airport and go home. And at this point, I didn't want to leave without some closure on this, some clarity about what had happened. So, working up my courage, about the same time of day the next day, I decided to return to that patch of woods for a third and final time. So, I retraced my steps again and got quite slow and cautious by the time I was getting near to this tree. And of course, immediately, the first thing I did when I could see the fallen tree was I looked over ahead and to the right to where this big black shape had been, the thing that had moved. And the chilling realization for me was that it wasn't there anymore. I looked at the exact spot where it had been, and I could tell, based on where I had been standing the night before, I wasn't mistaking it for a different spot. No, I knew where I was looking, and it just wasn't there. This thing was gone. So I'm running through all sorts of possibilities in my head. Within a few seconds, could it have been a root ball and maybe some crew of loggers came in? I know that some parts of that forest further down the road, there were some crews of guys doing logging work. Could they have cut up this root ball and the tree attached to it and dragged it away? But that didn't make any sense because there was no logging roads. It was a thick, untouched section of the forest that I later found out through Google Maps went on for miles. There's no way anyone could have gotten equipment in there to cut this thing up and drag it away if it had been a root ball. And again, there was the fact that I had seen it move and now it was gone. So that sealed for me without a doubt that it was a living creature of some sort, a massive 9 foot tall, 4 foot wide, black, indistinct looking, mountainous shaped creature of some kind. So, of course, my eyes are darting around like crazy and my heart's pumping. I'm thinking, this thing is still around. It's probably watching me somewhere. And, because of that fear, I did something, or rather, didn't do something that I now wish in hindsight I had done. I wish I had taken my phone and gotten a few seconds of footage of where the thing had been the day before. I have footage of the black shape itself, and I'll go more into that in a little bit. And it's in the video I made about this whole experience, but I wish I had taken the time and overcome my fear long enough to film the spot where it had been to show that it wasn't there anymore. But I didn't do that. At the time, I wasn't thinking about gathering evidence for YouTube or anything like that. I was just trying to gather a little bit of something to show my own family, who I knew would believe me and wouldn't need, exhaustive evidence to believe me because they trust me. So I'm looking around and every direction to the left and to the right, and I'm not seeing this thing. I don't see any trace of the black shape either where it had been the day before or in any other spot. So after a couple of minutes, I realized that either it's hiding really well or it's just not here anymore, whatever it was. So I decided to take my dad's advice and go right up to this fallen tree and take a closer look. So I do that cautiously, keeping my eyes peeled all the time for the black shape. And I get right up to the fallen tree and I notice that it didn't fall down from root rot or bug damage. I walk around to the bottom of it and the roots are exposed. It's been pushed right over, pulling the roots right out of the ground. And I poke the roots with my finger, and there's none of that moist, punky, spongy feeling when a tree has root rot. And there's not any damage or, bug holes or anything anywhere along the trunk either. It's just a great big, tall balsam tree with fresh green needles along all of its branches. and a trunk that is not rotten and that is perfectly sound. So I'm thinking, okay, maybe it was wind. Sometimes healthy trees that are not rotten or bug eaten can be pushed over by wind. But when you get a downburst of wind strong enough to uproot a great big 40-foot tall tree like that, if you've lived in the woods, you know that it'll affect more than just one tree. Like there's going to be a swath of trees down if that happens, if it's wind related. And this tree had multiple other trees of similar size, perfectly healthy and still upright and in the ground within 3 or 4 feet of it. So, a downburst of wind wouldn't have done that. It wouldn't just single out one tree and not touch any of the others, like, a yard or two away. So I was thinking more and more that whatever I saw, this monstrous black shape, did indeed push over this tree. And the twisting, wood creaking noise I had heard a couple of days earlier was indeed quite possibly the beginning of the process of that tree being pushed over. And as I examined the tree closely, and I got some footage of it, the roots and the green foliage and everything, I noticed something else that I hadn't seen the day before. Partially hidden by the green needled foliage of this fallen balsam, there was another tree underneath it, also fallen down, lying in exactly the same direction, parallel with the balsam, but obscured underneath it, as I said. And this other tree, unlike the balsam, which was held up from the ground a little bit by its branches, this other tree was almost right on the ground. That's why I hadn't noticed it the day before until I'd gotten right up to the balsam. This other tree was a birch, and the diameter of its trunk was even larger than the balsam. I'd say it could have been 18 inches at the bottom, thicker end. So of course, immediately I look at the top end of this fallen birch, and I'm looking under the balsam foliage, and the birch also had leaves all over its branches. They weren't fresh and green, they were brown and shriveled, as if it had been felled some time ago, and then the balsam had been felled more recently right on top of it. So I go back around to the bottom end of both trees. They were both felled in the same direction, as I said. And I look at the bottom of the birch, which is hard to see at first because of the balsam, but I find the bottom of it. And this is the really chilling and intriguing thing. Unlike the balsam tree, the birch had not been pushed out of the ground, roots and all. It appeared to have been snapped. This 18-inch diameter trunk was splintered like matchwood. And I found the bottom end of it. There were sharp, uneven spears of wood sticking out as if someone, had taken a pencil. The way when you break a pencil in your two hands like that, it'll splinter and have sharp pieces of wood. It was like a gigantic pair of hands had taken this 18-inch diameter trunk and done the pencil snapping thing. And it was just broken. It wasn't cut and it wasn't rotten. Because of the broken cross section of trunk, I was able to, poke that wood as well and see that, yeah, that's sound, solid birch wood. There's no rot there. There's no bug damage. This was a healthy birch tree that was just broken off. So I'm thinking, okay, it broke off somehow, which would take an incredible amount of force. Maybe that too was the wind somehow, even though the wind hypothesis didn't make sense for the reasons I mentioned. But regardless of what happened, the stump end of that birch should be nearby, I thought, because there's no roots or stump attached to this thing. It's just a broken off trunk, like I said. So I start looking around. I start making small circles around the two trees and gradually widening out into a wider and wider radius, all the while keeping my eyes out for this black shape, which I didn't see. And I made it to about 50 feet out from these two fallen trees in every direction, a circle, 50 feet out. And I didn't see hide nor hair of the birch trunk. No corresponding stump with, broken splinters and the roots still in the ground. No birch stumps or even other birch trees of any kind. Nothing. So I just have this massive 30 to 40-foot tall, broken off, 18-inch diameter, non-rotten birch tree in the middle of the woods with a freshly fallen, perfectly healthy balsam right on top of it. And I just couldn't make sense of that. unless it had been this black thing that I had seen the day before, marking its territory or setting up a barrier or a boundary or something. Nothing else made sense because healthy 18-inch diameter birch trees that are not internally rotten don't just snap like that. So I was disturbed enough by this development that I left the woods again. I felt like I was probably being watched by this black thing, despite the fact that I hadn't seen it again that day. I was sure that it was nearby. Call it an instinct, call it blind panic if you like, but I just felt that same palpable fear from the day before. And I felt that I had pretty conclusive evidence that something strange had gone on here. So I left. I left the woods and didn't go back again. Told my wife and my dad about it, and they were equally intrigued. And that was about it. The next day, we flew home, and later, at the suggestion of some close friends, I decided to sit down and tell the whole story I've just told you now, and incorporate my footage into it, including footage of the black shape and close-ups of the fallen trees and all of that. And kind of on a whim to post it to YouTube, not really expecting it to, get a lot of views or anything, but mostly because I just wanted to, get the story out there while it was still fresh in my mind. And maybe someone who sees it could help me make sense of this. That's what I was originally thinking. But the more time passed after we returned home, the more I realized that there's not really any uncertainty here. I kind of talked myself into the idea that, I don't really know what it was, but the more I thought about it, the more I thought, yeah, I do know what it was. It was what people call the Sasquatch. Because given all the facts put together, nothing else seems to make sense. And one more quick note. Before I put together the video telling this whole story, I was showing my family some of the footage I'd gotten of the black shape and the trees and things. And my wife was looking over my shoulder as I was doing this at one point, showing some close family friends the footage. And I was kind of zooming in on the phone screen so that I could see the black shape much more closely than I had been able to in real life at the time. And I noticed that the black shape seemed to have features of a head and a face and maybe even a shoulder and an arm when I zoomed in that far. And it was kind of blurry because of the amount of zoom I had to do, but it did kind of look more roughly humanoid when I did that zooming in. And in zooming in, my wife pointed out something that I hadn't seen before, kind of on the bottom left-hand side of this shape, far too distant for me to see at the time, as I said, but visible on the screen was a little bit of movement. And it kind of looked, it wasn't totally distinct, but it kind of looked like a hand opening and closing or moving back and forth a little. And it seemed to be where the hand would be if the thing that looked like a shoulder was a shoulder and the thing that looked like an arm was an arm. Then this little bit of movement would be roughly where the hand was. And it was moving a little bit. And then later, after posting my story and the footage that went along with it, I had someone write me an email, and they had taken some screenshots from my footage and enhanced them a little bit and sharpened them and pointed out that to the right-hand side, there was what looked like possibly a second creature with recognizable facial features, mostly obscured by foliage, which is why I didn't notice it the first time looking through the footage. But the more I looked at it, the more I thought, yeah, it kind of does look like a second one. So perhaps there were two of these things. I'm not 100% sure on that, but it does look that way. But there was at the very least one massive hulking black shape that moved in front of me and then was not there the next day, that I believe was responsible for felling two large healthy trees. For what reason, I don't know. I also think that one of these creatures, maybe even that very one, was responsible for whipping that white quartz pebble at my daughter and I, and that's what started this investigation off. So that was my experience.
Wow. I can say that you were definitely consistent with trying to get more information, trying to get more evidence, looking for this. I can't put myself in your shoes because I think that would be a little bit scary. But how has this changed you since you had this experience?
Well, I guess the biggest way is that I went from thinking that Sasquatch is most likely a real creature based on the bulk of eyewitness accounts and footprints and evidence I had learned about through researching this as a casual hobby. I went from mostly convinced to a knower, as they say, because of what I saw and what I experienced. And people who consider themselves knowers, who have had experiences, I'm sure can identify with when I say that there's a fundamental difference between thinking they probably exist and knowing absolutely that they do. So that knowledge is probably the biggest change that comes to mind. And along with that, this sparking a fire of enthusiasm in me to continue learning more about these things, to uncover the full truth of what they are and why they're here, and are we dealing with just a regular flesh and blood creature that is so far undiscovered by science, or what about all the accounts that involve high strangeness that people mention? I mean, are all of those people lying or mistaken or a little bit flighty in their thinking? The glowing eyes and the cloaking. And I don't have my conclusions fully formed on that, but to answer your original question, the biggest change has been the absolute certainty that they exist and an unquenchable hunger to learn what they are and
A
to.
lot of people that have some form of personal experience like that really want to have another experience and another and another. That's what takes them back into the woods, the boots on the ground, trying to find out more. And some people have an opposite reaction. They don't want to have another experience because it was too frightening. It doesn't sound like yours was so frightening that you couldn't get back in the woods and look again.
No, well, I think that what helped for me is that first of all, I live in the woods, so I knew like I'm going to have an issue if I have an aversion to going into the woods again because my house is in the woods. For one thing, there was that, but also the creature didn't do much when I saw it. It mostly just stayed still, a little bit of movement, but it didn't growl at me or bluff charge me like you sometimes hear. I mean, I didn't even get a good look at it. I just saw that there was something there, something massive and dark that wasn't there the next day. So, maybe if it had acted more threatening and I'd had more of a face to face encounter, I'd feel differently. But for now, although there was plenty of fear at the time, that's sort of worn away and given way to this, as I said, this deep desire to learn more and to continue researching. And when I say researching, I mean both looking into the experiences other people have had, but really, my heart is in boots on the ground research, going out there myself. And yeah, like you said, having another experience, gathering more evidence so we can get a handle on what these things are and, shed some light on this mystery.
Absolutely. So if people want to see the photographs you took, the video that you took, where can they go find that?
So if you just search on YouTube for Cabin in the Woods Bigfoot, that will bring up my channel. And I've released about 8 videos about Bigfoot right now, but the first one I did was the one I've been talking about. I think the title is Bigfoot threw a rock at my daughter and then I saw him, or something like that. So if people look up Cabin in the Woods Bigfoot, that will bring my channel up and you can find this specific story from there.
Very good. I hope everyone looks at that, and I plan to go look at it right now. So thank you so much for being with me. I'm going to go ahead and end our recording today, but we'll stay in touch. And if you find out anything else, I want to know. Okay.
Absolutely. I'll certainly
Okay.
keep you informed. Thank you very much for
Great.
having me, Linda.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye bye.